I'm about to end this man's whole career.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 3 of Game of Thrones Rewrite. And before you ask, yes, I do offer Photoshop lessons. Inquire below. Today's subject, Jon Snow. This video will serve as the conclusion for the first trio of characters for this series, and thus you will learn the fates of both Jon Snow and Tyrion Lannister in this rewrite. While I felt Jon's arc throughout the majority of the TV series was handled pretty well, with only a few missteps here and there which I will discuss, I think most fans can agree that Jon's portrayal in Season 8 is a borderline travesty. After spending 7 seasons drawing Jon as a reluctant but noble hero, to see him relegated to a pussy-whipped little bitch who isn't able to make up his damn mind was heartbreaking to say the absolute least. But we'll get to that. Let's do a quick recap. At the beginning of the series, we established Jon as the bastard of Ned Stark. Though he has a close relationship with most of the Stark family, well, besides Catelyn of course,
this is why Mom doesn't fucking love you!
He is constantly reminded of the fact that he is not and never will be a Stark, which is what fuels his decision to join the Night's Watch along with his beloved Uncle Benjen, in hopes of finally finding somewhere he belongs. Jon begins the first season as a frustrated and somewhat arrogant young man, who has quite the temper, especially when his status as a bastard is brought up. But after being mentored by the likes of Tyrion Lannister, Lord Commander Mormont, and Maester Aemon, he comes to learn that being a man of the Night's Watch requires one to be selfless, to serve the greater good, and to not let a man's own wants supersede his duty. This progression is evident at the end of the first season when he decides to forsake his vows to join his brother Robb's campaign against the Lannisters, only to reconsider when Maester Aemon reveals himself as Aemon Targaryen, who kept his vows to the Night's Watch even as his bloodline was decimated during Robert's Rebellion. After Jon's father, okay, that's the last one, Ned Stark, is executed at King's Landing, Jon flees in a rage of revenge, but is stopped by his fellow Night's Watch brothers, who convince him to honor his vows and return to Castle Black. Jon, like Maester Aemon, has passed his test. He has chosen the Watch over his own ego. Season 2 begins with Jon accompanying Jorah Mormont's ranging party in their search for Benjen Stark. Jon later joins the ranging group of Qhorin Halfhand, which is where he first meets Ygritte. Eventually, Jon and Qhorin are taken prisoner by the wildlings, and Qhorin, seeing an opportunity for Jon to infiltrate the wildling camp, allows himself to be killed by Jon, which results in Jon earning the trust of the wildlings. Season 3 begins with Jon being introduced to Mance Rayder and joins the wildling group on their excursion south of the Wall in preparation for their impending attack on Castle Black. Jon falls deeply in love with Ygritte during this time and successfully attains his nut, but he eventually forsakes Ygritte and the wildlings, keeping his duty intact, and returns to Castle Black, warning his fellow brothers that Mance Rayder and his wildling army are marching south. Season 4 shows Jon preparing for the impending attack by Mance's wildling army. The brothers of Castle Black are able to deflect the wildling assault, but Jon loses Ygritte in the process. Soon after the Battle of Castle Black, Jon attempts to give his own life to assassinate Mance Rayder, but is interrupted by the arrival of Stannis Baratheon and his forces. Season 5 begins with Jon and Stannis holding down the fort of Castle Black. Stannis offers to legitimize Jon and make him Lord of Winterfell in exchange for Jon's help against the Boltons. But Jon refuses, once again staying loyal to his vows. Shortly after, Jon, due to his bravery and leadership during the Battle of Castle Black, is elected Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, succeeding his former mentor, Jorah Mormont. Now I want to stop right here for a moment because this is where the third book in the series, A Storm of Swords, ends. This is also, at least in the books, the exact same time that Daenerys Targaryen chooses to stay in Meereen and try her hand at diplomacy. How coincidental. We'll come back to this. If we look back at Jon's arc up to this point, we see a clear character progression taking place. In Season 1, Jon must remain at Castle Black rather than joining Robb's army. In Season 2, Jon must kill a fellow brother in order to attain the trust of the wildlings. In Seasons 3 and 4, Jon must sacrifice his love for Ygritte in order to protect Castle Black. And in Season 5, Jon must refuse Stannis' offer of legitimacy, something he has always wanted, in order to stay true to his vows. Jon is continuously put in situations where he must put his duty above all else, no matter how difficult it may be to do so. It's clear, it's simple, it's perfect. The series up until this point has been pretty faithful to the books when it comes to Jon, but it's in Season 5 where the show begins to play fast and loose with some aspects of Jon's character, which in turn results in, let's say, problematic show developments. In my first video, I made a crack about Jon being a Gary Stew. Now, while he doesn't technically fit the definition as we see him struggle and sacrifice quite a bit throughout the series, my point was that as the series went on, the showrunners and writers began to erase the more morally questionable aspects of many of the characters, especially in the second half of the series, where we saw a lot of characters start to get put into good guy and bad guy camps. Cersei Lannister, a character who was probably one of the most complex of the series, was basically reduced to a one-dimensional one-dimensional psycho for the last 2 seasons, while characters such as Arya Stark, who was a very morally questionable character in the books, is basically made a total hero in the series. This simplification of many of the characters' morality unfortunately leads to a more simplified, and thus more predictable, narrative. What made the Battle of the Blackwater so tense was that we understood the motivations of each faction, and there were characters on both sides who we wanted to see come out on top. Because the show didn't set this battle up as a straight-up good guy versus bad guy scenario, the audience isn't exactly sure who they want to win, and thus makes the narrative more suspenseful and unpredictable. Compare that with the Battle of the Bastards, which, while still being a hell of an episode, I don't think anyone had any moral dilemma as to who they wanted to see come out victorious, and I doubt anyone was really that surprised at which side did. There isn't anything inherently wrong with having just straight-up heroic and villainous characters duking it out, but in a series that was praised for its audacity to give even its most morally questionable characters such a level of complexity where you really couldn't consider any one of them a solely good or bad guy, it was disappointing when the series began to do away with this complexity, especially when it came to its more villainous characters. The reason I bring this up is because out of all the characters of the series, Jon Snow is probably the closest thing there is to a completely morally good character, which again isn't inherently bad. Sometimes it's nice to have a character that the audience can root for unquestionably. The issue is that in an effort to keep Jon as Jesus-y as possible, and it's not like they didn't lay that comparison on pretty thick or anything, they cut out a good deal of plot points in Season 5 that shortchanges his character quite a bit. Following Jon becoming Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, we see him struggle with his newfound leadership role. Jon proved himself as a capable commander and leader on the battlefield, but now he must juggle the complexities of diplomacy, particularly in coordinating Stannis' upcoming battle with the Boltons and quelling relations between the men of the Night's Watch and the wildlings. Throughout Jon's time serving as Lord Commander, he continuously refers back to a piece of advice given to him by Master Aemon right after he becomes Lord Commander.
You will find little joy in your command, but with luck, you will find the strength to do what needs to be done. Kill the boy, Jon Snow. Winter is almost upon us. Kill the boy, and let the man be born.
Jon begins to realize that in order to be a successful leader, one must, in some cases, compromise his or her own morals and ideals, a lesson he partially learned from Jorah Mormont, who was forced to stomach the treatment of the woman of Craster's Keep in Season 2, as it was beneficial for the Watch. The show cuts out a few, 3 in particular, of Jon's more morally questionable acts that show the toll that his newfound leadership is having on him. The first is that, while on the show, Sam asks Jon for permission to travel to the Citadel to become a maester. In the books, Jon commands Sam to do so, much to Sam's dismay. This isn't that bad, but does show that Jon's beginning to make his decisions with what is best for the Watch as his primary motivation, which in this case includes sending away his best friend. The second is the fact that following Jon's decision to allow the remainder of the Wildling army to come south of the Wall following the Battle of Castle Black, Jon demands that the Wildlings turn over hostages to ensure they won't cause any trouble once they're south of the Wall. I insisted upon hostages. I am not the trusting fool you take me for, nor am I half Wildling, no matter what you believe. 100 boys between the ages of 8 and 16, a son from each of their chiefs and captains, the rest chosen by lot. As of now in the books, no harm has come to any of the hostages, and hopefully no harm will. But again, it shows that Jon is doing things that are seemingly quite out of character, but, as Master Aemon said, are necessary in order to keep the peace. And while Jon obviously doesn't want to hurt the hostages, it is made clear in the books that Tormund believes that if it came to it, Jon would harm the hostages. The fact that Tormund is sold on the idea that Jon is capable of doing such a thing certainly shows a shift in Jon's character. The third is perhaps the most morally questionable act he commits in the entire series up to this point, and it has to do with Gilly's child. In the books, Mance Rayder fathers a child before he is killed. Yeah, it's a whole other thing in the book. Look into it if you're interested, or just read the books if you haven't already. They're kinda okay. Seeing as Mance's baby has quote-unquote royal blood, Jon fears that Melisandre may sacrifice Mance's baby in order to ensure a victory for Stannis against the Boltons. In order to avoid this, Jon forces Gilly to switch her child with Mance's. Gilly will travel travel to Old Town with Sam and Mance's child, while Gilly's baby will remain at Castle Black, disguised as Mance's child. I know it's a little confusing. Jon's reasoning behind this act is that if Melisandre decides to sacrifice Mance's baby, Jon can reveal to her that the baby is in fact Gilly's and has no royal blood, thus saving Mance's child from being sacrificed. Again, Jon is technically doing this for a moral reason, but he is still forcing a mother to part from her child and then putting that child in a very risky situation, seeing as Jon's plan requires him to inform Melisandre of the baby's true identity if she plans to sacrifice it. But if something were to happen to Jon, well, he may not be able to tell her the truth before it's too late. Also, and this is simply a book theory, if Mance's child is not available for sacrifice, then Melisandre may choose someone else, thus making Jon inadvertently responsible. Again, these three acts are far from the most morally questionable in the series. But it does show Jon's progression from a morally pure character into a leader who is forced to make decisions he may not necessarily want to make, but must in order to ensure the best for his people. I think the showrunners removed these plot developments to ensure that Jon remained pure as fuck, and didn't do anything that could be considered even remotely morally questionable. In Season 5, Jon really doesn't do anything that shows that the Lord Commander position is taking a toll on him, and making him more ruthless than ever before. I mean, yeah, he beheads Janos Slynt like he does in the books, but fuck Janos Slynt. The showrunners knew no one would give a shit.
Right in the fucking head! Yeah!
But one of the biggest changes is the circumstances surrounding the mutiny of Castle Black. In the show, Jon's betrayed by members of the Night's Watch, supposedly due to the fact that he allowed the wildlings south of the wall. However, I would argue that this really isn't the case. I mean, it's the case for Ollie, but fuck Ollie. In Season 5, they really build Alliser Thorne up as Jon's antagonist. He's a dick in the books too, but the show just makes him comically evil and resentful towards Jon. When Alliser leads the mutiny against Jon, it really has nothing to do with Jon allowing the wildlings south of the wall. I mean, again, maybe for some of them, and that shitheel Ollie, but I think it's clear that Alliser shanks Jon because he's just hated Jon since day one. They did sort of retcon this when Jon ends up hanging them and Alliser is trying to be all magnanimous and shit, but I think it's clear even by his reaction to shanking Jon at the end of Season 5 that this was totally personal. So again, the showrunners couldn't help themselves but to reduce the mutiny to a one-dimensional good guy versus bad guy situation. But in the book, it's a lot more interesting. Tensions at Castle Black have been rising since the wildlings were led south of the wall, and while a good portion of the Watch isn't too happy about it, they keep their heads down and accept Jon's decision. However, sometime after Stannis leaves Castle Black to confront the Boltons, Jon receives a letter from Ramsay Snow, stating that Stannis and his forces have been defeated. Now we know due to released chapters of the 6th book in the series, The Winds of Winter, that this is in fact a lie, as Stannis' forces have yet to do battle with the Boltons, whereas in the show, Jon receives the letter after Stannis is defeated. In the book, the letter is enough for Jon to lose his temper and plans to ride south with any wildlings and Night's Watchmen who will come with him to confront Ramsay. This is in direct violation of Jon's vows, and thus, before Jon is able to march on the Boltons, he is knifed by members of the Night's Watch, though it is not clear in the book if he actually dies, but he probably does. So in the book, the mutiny is in response to Jon forsaking his vows, a brilliantly ironic mirror image of Jon's decision at the beginning of the 1st book, when he decided to not forsake his vows to help attack the Lannisters. At least one member of the Night's Watch is in tears when he stabs Jon. They aren't killing him because they're butthurt towards him for personal reasons, they're doing it in order to uphold their vows. This is why they say, for the Watch, because they're doing it, for the Watch. The show totally nerfs the irony and poetry of the phrase, and thus strips away a lot of its impact. Shit, in the book, Alliser Thorne isn't even at Castle Black when all this goes down. So yeah, pretty much the whole latter part of Season 5 was a letdown for Jon's characterization. But the show gets him back on track come Season 6, which is mainly comprised of Jon gearing up for his battle against Ramsay, and he of course comes out victorious, winning over the people of the North and being named King of the North. Season 6 is pretty good for Jon, no real issues there. And then comes Jon's arc in Season 7 and 8, and oh god, here we go. Jon's prepping for the battle against the White Walkers, and then when he hears word that Daenerys Targaryen has landed in Westeros, he is summoned by her, and she eventually offers to help Jon if he bends the knee to her. Romance begins between Jon and Dany, and then there's the whole kidnap the White Walker plot. I don't really want to go into it, but after Dany saves Jon and co behind the wall, Jon pledges his loyalty to her before once again attaining his nut. So Season 7 is pretty consistent with who Jon's been since the beginning of the series. He needs to defeat the White Walkers to save the people of Westeros for the greater good. He doesn't care about the throne or being king or politics or whatever. He simply wants to do what is right because it's right. But as we see partially in Season 7 and completely in Season 8, it isn't just that Jon doesn't care about the throne or to lead, he actively doesn't want it in any capacity. This is, in my opinion, the missing piece of Jon's character progression. Why in Season 8 is Jon so against becoming king? Again, we can understand that Jon doesn't care about becoming king, but why does he actively show a distaste for being a leader? When all things considered, he has done a pretty decent job at being Lord Commander and acting as King of the North. Well, remember how I mentioned at the end of A Storm of Swords that Jon being named Lord Commander directly coincided with Daenerys claiming herself Queen of Meereen? Well, it turns out that if you put Dany and Jon's arcs side by side, you'll start to see more parallels than you may have realized. As the saying goes, when a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin, and unsurprisingly, Jon and Dany represent each side of that coin. This is evident by their clear physical differences, man and woman, black and white color schemes, but it is also displayed through how they handle somewhat similar situations. At the beginning of the first book in the series, Dany and Jon begin in roughly similar circumstances. Both young, insecure, not really sure where their place is just yet. But by the end of the book, Dany takes control over the Khalasar and pledges to conquer Westeros, just as Khal Drogo pledged for her, whereas Jon, rather than taking power, pledges to keep his vows to the Night's Watch. Dany rises to be a leader to avenge her family, while Jon decides to swallow his pride and stay loyal to the Watch. Similar circumstances, opposite reactions. The second book, A Clash of Kings, end with a parallel as well. At the book's end, we see Jon successfully gain the respect of the wildlings and is invited into their camp. Meanwhile, Dany fails to successfully assimilate to the ways of Qarth, and, as stated in Dany's video, in the book, she is eventually cast out of the city. At the end of A Storm of Swords, we see Dany assert herself as Queen of Meereen, whereas Jon is voted democratically as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Dany takes power where Jon is thrust into it. But it's in A Dance of Dragons where their parallel plots are at their most evident. As we discussed in our last video, Dany is struggling to keep peace with Meereen by resorting to peaceful diplomatic solutions, in contrast with her earlier cutthroat ways, whereas Jon is struggling with the same diplomacy issues at Castle Black, but rather than keeping with his noble and moral ways, he begins to resort to more extreme measures, the measures that were cut out of the show because of course they were. And, just like Dany suffers a failure in Meereen, Jon suffers a failure at Castle Black. Now, as we talked about with Dany's video, the show didn't do the best job of communicating Dany's reactions to her failure at Meereen. In our rewrite, it is Dany's failure at Meereen that causes her to revert back to her conquering ways come Season 7. So I think we can make the same, but opposite assertion about Jon. Following the mutiny at Castle Black, Jon realizes that being a king isn't for him. His time as Lord Commander led him to do things that he would never do otherwise, such as sending away his best friend, taking innocent children hostage, and of course, taking a baby away from her mother and putting him in a risky situation. Perhaps if the theory in the books that Melisandre will end up sacrificing someone, whether it be Shireen or Mance's child, to resurrect Jon, this will give Jon even more misgivings about his role as a leader. Dany let her failure cause her to become more of a tyrant. Jon recognizes what leadership is doing to him and decides he doesn't want to get the better of him. This is why he's so adamant about not wanting the throne later in Season 8, after discovering his true parentage. He faces off against Ramsay and the White Walkers, but he does this for the greater good, not for some throne or title he couldn't give a damn about. And then he is made king in the North, and you can totally tell he's like fucking pissed and just like wants to retire, but like, nah, sorry kid. Alright, back to Season 7. Jon needs to kill the White Walkers and needs Dany's help to do it. He doesn't give a damn about the throne, but at the same time, Jon wants to ensure that whoever does sit on the throne will do the right thing by the people of Westeros. So like I said in the Dany video, the romance is out. Instead, Dany is taken by Jon's personality and charisma. He is the leader she always dreamed about being. With Jon's help, Dany starts to believe that she can rule Westeros as the magnanimous queen she's always wanted to be, and perhaps Jon can show her how. Coercively, Jon sees Dany as his way out. He knows that if he can ensure Dany will be a just ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, that he can rest easy knowing the people of Westeros are in good hands. This is why Jon tries his best to bring out the better side of Dany, very similar to how Bruce Wayne wanted Harvey Dent to take over as Gotham's Defender in The Dark Knight, so he can retire as Batman. Once again, Photoshop lessons are available. I think this works better than the romance. In the show, it makes it seem like the only reason Jon wants Dany to be queen is because he's trying to get her back in the sack as soon as possible. But then later, he doesn't even want to bang her and still supports her like Gee, like, what the fuck, Jon? And even if it wasn't the idea represented in this rewrite, they could have done so much with their relationship. They could have easily just had Jon learn of his true parentage a little bit earlier than season 8, and made it about Jon struggling with his Targaryen versus Stark identity. And I guess this is sort of what they tried to do with Jon and not petting Ghost, but they didn't telegraph this well at all, and just makes Jon ghosting Ghost. Get it? Make him look like a total fucking dick. I just hate it when writers use random forced romance to serve as a character's motivation instead of, I don't know, actually analyzing their wants and needs and having those wants and needs translate to actions. But Jon wants to get his dick wet, good enough. So Dany wants Jon to show her how to be a just queen, and Jon wants Dany to rule justly over Westeros so he can fuck off and not have to worry about it anymore. But unfortunately, both Dany and Jon's hopes are crushed come season 8. As Dany begins to realize she will never be loved by the people of Westeros, she comes to the sullen realization that they will never accept her as their queen. And Jon, after realizing he is the heir to the throne, literally his worst fucking nightmare, and as he slowly starts to realize that Dany is on the verge of going absolute nuts, he starts to resign to the fact that his one chance of leaving Westeros in worthy hands is a total bust. Also, a quick little gripe here, what the fuck was with Jon needing to tell Sansa and Arya about his true parentage? Jon, the whole fucking point of Ned lying about your true identity was to avoid drama like this. The lesson you should have learned from him is that sometimes keeping one little secret is sometimes totally chill. Ironically, this is exactly what Jon does in the book by switching Mance's and Gilly's babies, but of course they cut that out, so yeah. As for how they could have done this differently, why not just have Arya or Sansa or even Varys just overhear Jon and Dany discussing his parentage? Sure, it'd be a little contrived, but this would lead to the same effect and would be way more plausible than Jon just fucking needing to tell his sisters the truth because fucking plot, I guess. I don't know. Quick aside, a user asked if I could write Howland Reed into this, but in an effort to stay away from too much rewriting, I'm just gonna stick with Jon's true heritage being revealed by Sam reading a fucking book and Bran turning into Dr. Manhattan. I'm not happy about it, but there it is. For you show watchers, just to give some insight to this, Howland Reed was of course the only one of Ned Stark's men to survive the Battle of the Tower of Joy. But what's so odd in the book series is that Howland Reed has yet to make an appearance. Odd considering he is with Ned in the Tower of Joy, and even is the one who takes Ned's hand out of the dead lianas, and thus he must know the truth about Jon. The most prominent and solid theory to explain this is that Howland Reed will come forward at some point in the last 2 books, and he will be the one to tell Jon of his true heritage. This makes the most sense as to why Martin is keeping him so mysterious in the books until the endgame. It just sucks that the show didn't utilize him any further and frankly treats him like shit. They mention him like a few times and then show him in the flashback to the Tower of Joy, but then they just completely forget about him like it was nothing to even give it. Wait, hold on. Is this supposed to be Howland Reed? Is this supposed to be Howland Reed? This rando with no lines in the finale scene? One of the most mysterious and important characters in the series reduced to a shit background cameo? Are you kidding me? Are you fucking kidding? Okay, I took a shot at Jack and I've calmed down. By the way, all the proceeds of my Photoshop lessons will go towards funding a new living room window, as I just tossed my computer keyboard through it during my rage break. Okay, so apparently this isn't Howland Reed. He is Riverland's Lord. Okay. Why'd they even add him in the scene if they're not even going to give him any dialogue or just... Jesus Christ. Fun fact, this actor, Andrew Bicknell, is quite prolific, and even was one of the ferry captains in The Dark Knight. Alright, let's get back to it. So yeah, in season 8, Dany is starting to lose it, and Jon is desperately hanging on to the possibility that she can win over the people of Westeros. But after she burns King's Landing, he realizes that's never gonna happen. Quick edit, a few people mentioned on Dany's video that if Dany is quote-unquote forced to burn the innocents of King's Landing due to her need to destroy the scorpions on the streets, that the Westerosi people would understand. But I just don't buy that. Even if you could justify Dany's actions, the fact that she killed so many innocent people will still completely sever her goodwill to the rest of the people all over Westeros. They will never be able to love and respect her without it being primarily fueled by fear. Also keep in mind that the people of Westeros were already on the fence about her, and the fact that she is a crazy-ass Targ doesn't help matters. We as an audience may be able to understand her actions, but the people of Westeros, at least in my opinion, will never be able to. So Dany destroys King's Landing and Jon is devastated. Realizing the woman he thought could bring peace to the land only brought ashes. And as we know for our rewrite, Tyrion kills Dany on the steps of King's Landing. I know a lot of you said that you didn't mind Jon killing Dany, and I guess I don't either. I mean, it fit with his whole duty over self character progression that he has been dealing with the entire series. The only gripe I had was that it seemed a bit too similar to Ygritte's death. Like, they already did the I have to sacrifice the woman I love for the greater good plot point. Sure, he didn't exactly kill Ygritte because that fuckwad Ollie did it for him. It just seemed a bit like treading old ground. I suppose if they removed the romance portion of the relationship, I don't see why Jon killing Dany wouldn't work. And I agree with a lot of you that this is probably the direction the books are going to take. However, I think Tyrion killing Dany is a bit more unexpected and fits in with his and Dany's relationship in our rewrite. Also, it is essential for how Jon and Tyrion end up in this particular rewrite. Another quick edit, I saw a few of you were a bit confused as to why Tyrion would kill Dany here, seeing as he is the one who brought her the Westeros for revenge in the first place, so I think I may not have articulated this arc well enough in the video. The idea would be that Tyrion would be blinded by rage up until the end of, say, season 7, but then something happens that snaps him out of it. It could be watching Jaime almost being killed by Dany, perhaps he finds out about Tommen and Myrcella's death later on, perhaps he feels immense guilt over Varys' death, or perhaps Tyrion learns of Cersei's pregnancy later on than he does in the show, and thus, this is what makes him reconsider whether or not he is doing the right thing. It could be the one thing or a combo of these things, just something that makes Tyrion snap out of his revenge and reconsider his actions, which leads to him killing Dany to spare the rest of the world a similar fate. Okay, with all that said, on to the conclusion of Jon and Tyrion's arcs. Tyrion is being held prisoner at King's Landing by Grey Worm and the Unsullied following his assassination of Dany. Meanwhile, Jon and the other lords meet and discuss what should be done, just as they did in the show. And after discussing and bickering for a short while, they come to the most logical conclusion. Jon must sit on the Iron Throne. Jon's entire arc was about learning that being a leader or being a king isn't all it's cracked up to be. Jon began the series as an aimless boy searching for purpose, dreaming of being Lord of Winterfell, and in the books, dreaming of conquerors and kings. But as greatness was thrust upon him, he slowly realizes that being a true leader means having to remain loyal to your duties, even as those he cared about were put in perilous danger. That taking the life of a comrade is sometimes necessary, even when it's painful to do so. That remaining true to the oath you made may result in you losing the one thing you love most. That when given the chance to prove wrong all of those who told you you were illegitimate, you must refuse in order to step up to the call and lead your brothers through the darkest of nights, even if it leads to your own demise. That no matter who blocks your path to a peaceful world, no matter how evil or insurmountable a threat you may face, that you will never back down, that you will never surrender. And finally, when the people who you spent so long defending, the people you gave everything for, that for your whole life called you less than, ask you once more to lead them without a single ounce of gratitude, you answer the call. It doesn't matter what you want, you follow your duty. Just as the great men who came before him, Master Aemon, Commander Mormont, Qhorin Halfhand, Benjen Stark, and, of course, Ned Stark, all did. Dany was the girl who wanted to rule, but couldn't. Jon is the boy who didn't want to rule, but must. A bastard to a king. Not because of lineage or politics, simply because of the courage in his heart. He killed the boy and became the man. And look, I know that this isn't the most surprising result and may seem somewhat predictable, and having Bran sit on the throne is so much more subversive, but being subversive for the sake of being subversive isn't good storytelling. If at the end of Casablanca, standing on the runway, Rick Blaine shot and killed Ingrid Bergman, and then he and Victor Laszlo were then revealed to be secret gay lovers and fled to America together, well, that actually sounds pretty dope. But you get my point. Subversion must be used with a purpose. A show like The Wire uses massive amounts of subversion, but it's always calculated and has a purpose to the theme or story. Game of Thrones uses it just so they could say, hey, you didn't see that coming, did you? Well, yeah, because it was dumb as hell. And if you think about it, Jon becoming king is actually pretty subversive in terms of Jon's character. Jon wanted to be a ruler as a young man, but as he grew older and saw the horrors and hardships of being a commander, he realizes he doesn't want it. But now he must do so. It's as if, in a way, he is shackled by his duty. In fact, the one time he went against his duty, it cost him his life. Well, his first one anyway. Jon being crowned king is actually bittersweet. As we know, Jon doesn't want it, but he must do it. This idea of Jon being a prisoner to his duty is even expressed in Alistair Thorne's final words before being executed.
Now I rest. But you, Lord Snow, you'll be fighting their battles forever.
But wait, you may say, how can Jon become king if he's a bastard? Well, couple things. One, I think at this point they may just say fuck it and just let him do it. After all he's done in the north and seeing as the land is absolutely decimated by war, I think they would be totally cool with making an exception this one time. I also think it would be fitting, as it would end up accomplishing Dany's original mission of breaking the wheel. Jon becomes king not because of who his father was, but because he earned it. However, if you don't like that and think that Jon could never be king because he was never legitimized, well, what if I told you that Jon actually is legitimized, at least in the books? Well, maybe. Okay, let me explain. In A Storm of Swords, shortly before the Red Wedding, Robb Stark learns that Tyrion Lannister has married Sansa Stark, thus giving their potential son control of Winterfell. With him believing that both Bran and Rickon are dead, and considering the possibility that his wife might not give birth to a son, Robb considers doing the only thing he can do to prevent such a thing: legitimizing Jon Snow as Jon Stark. Now, before I get too ahead of myself, the book technically never confirms this. At the end of chapter 45 of A Storm of Swords, Robb states, "I have no son as of yet. My brothers Bran and Rickon are dead, and my sister is wed to a Lannister. I've thought long and hard about who might follow me. I command you now, as my true and loyal lords, to fix your seals to this document as witnesses to my decision." And then the chapter fucking ends. And of course, a few chapters later. So the books never confirm it, but it is confirmed in George R.R. Martin's A World of Ice and Fire, A Game of Thrones guide, a companion guide for the book series, which was at least partially contributed to by Martin himself. So again, not necessarily canon, but close enough maybe? But again, let's say that this is true, that Robb legitimized him. It doesn't matter. It's highly probable that most of Robb's bannermen were killed during the War of the Five Kings, most of them probably at the Red Wedding. So who could have possibly been present at Robb's side when he legitimized Jon, and who would still be alive to confirm it? Could there be such a person? Edmure was present at the meeting where Robb made Jon legitimate, and thus can confirm Robb's decision, or perhaps he knows where a copy of Robb's will is. Now at the time, Robb legitimized Jon even while knowing that Jon, being a man of the Night's Watch, wouldn't be able to become Lord of Winterfell, even if he wanted to. But Robb basically says just fuck it, I'll figure it out when the time comes. Or you could even say that since the White Walker threat is taken care of, and they have made peace with the wildlings, that there's actually no need for a Night's Watch, and it's to be disbanded. Right, you guys? Then Jon is released from his vows anyway. And what's the beauty of this? If Jon was legitimized by Robb, and is in fact Jon Stark, not only would it complete Jon's series-long want to be known as an official Stark, then in order for him to take the throne, he must never speak of his Targaryen heritage, as it would dispute his legitimacy. In what would be the most gigantic stroke of irony in the entire series, Jon, like Ned did before him for so many years, must keep the same secret in order to ensure his claim to the throne is intact. Sure, he could also just say like, hey guys, I'm a Targ. But I feel like the Targaryen name doesn't have the highest stock price at this point, so might be a little risky. This development would also give Edmure something to do useful in the finale, instead of just getting dunked on by Sansa. Jon's heritage, one of the most pressing questions of the entire series, never even matters. I mean, that's totally how it works out in the show, but in our rewrite scenario, it would be semi-poetic, not just utterly and completely pointless like it was in D&D's demented show outline. But yeah, whether Jon is Jon Stark, or tells the council of his Targaryen heritage, or the council just gives it to him because fuck it, why not? No matter how you get there, Jon should sit on the Iron Throne. But there is one more step. Sorry, it's a bittersweet show, so it has to have a bittersweet end. Despite the council's choosing of Jon as king of the Seven Kingdoms, this is not enough to appease Grey Worm and the Unsullied. Like, okay, yeah, like Grey Worm would be totally cool with Jon playing fucking Boy Scout in the woods while he and the Unsullied fuck off. Like, is he gonna come back every couple of years just to make Jon is still chilling in the north? Like, come the fuck on. But yeah, Grey Worm isn't going to let the death of his queen go. Neither is Yara, as she is seen in the finale to still be loyal to Dany. I guess she didn't get the most recent memo. Grey Worm and the Unsullied will not yield until justice is served against the one who killed their queen. And thus, the council decides, in order to end the conflict and finally bring peace to the Seven Kingdoms, Jon must execute Tyrion. The one man who showed him kindness at the beginning of the series, the man who told him to never forget who he is, He is his last test. Jon and Tyrion have one last conversation before Tyrion's death. Jon knows Tyrion killed Dany for the right reason, but no one else does. Tyrion accepts his fate, acknowledging the destruction he has brought to his former home. But he is at peace with the knowledge that even though the people of Westeros will forever consider him a monster, the kingdom is in good hands, as long as Jon sits on the throne. The friends say goodbye, and in front of the remaining lords of the Seven Kingdoms, on the same spot where Dany was killed, Jon executes Tyrion. The War of the Five Kings officially began with a Lannister killing a Stark, and it ends with a Stark killing a Lannister. Jon then takes his place on the Iron Throne, perhaps with his brother Bran as his hand, the entirety of human knowledge at his side, and yet the future uncertain. Well, that's all I have for you folks today. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Game of Thrones Rewrite. Hope we were able to give a fitting end to Jon's arc. Then again, considering the botched lobotomy Jon's fate was in the show, this isn't exactly all that hard to top. This concludes the first trio of our GOT Rewrite series. Next up, the OG Mad Queen of the series, Cersei Lannister. Now before I finish up, I just want to let you guys know that over on the community tab, I put a link letting you guys know which characters have their own videos slated. Now you can post in the comments to let me know if there's any characters who you want to see a rewrite for. After seeing a couple of your comments and reconsidering it, I think it's official. I'm going to do a Stannis video. I was kind of on the fence and I wasn't too sure about it, but I think that I can put something together for you guys if you really want to see it. It's not going to come anytime soon, but probably till once all the others are done, so maybe a while from now. I'm also considering doing a Jorah video. I think that's going to happen. And I know I mentioned before, and I'm kind of going back on it, but after you guys mentioned and you guys really want to see it, I think I'm going to do a White Walker video. I'm probably going to double this up with Bran's arc. For people who are, into like fan theories, you'll understand why. But yeah, a Bran and the White Walkers will be coming as well. All right, that's all I have for you guys. Make sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you don't miss a video. And as always, thank you so much for your support.